Well, welcome back to the part two of this week's More Bad News, brought to you as always by Camel Cigarettes. Take the Camel's Challenge, smoke Camels for 30 days and see for yourself why Americans would walk a mile for Camels. What I wanted to do is to talk about the Negro in the American Revolution. And the reason why I've titled it that is because this talk comes directly from a book by Herbert Aptheker on the American Revolution, and chapter 8 is called The Negro in the Revolution. Herbert Aptheker was a incredible American historian. He was a communist, and the communists were, to my mind, the best when it came to facing American racism. Um, so um, so I have my notes here, and I'm just going to go through this. And part one of this is going to be just kind of a review of this chapter of what Aptheker has to say about the role of the Negro in the American Revolution. And part two will be some comments that I have about the irony of the American Revolution. And when you think about it, the American Revolution was fought on the principles of that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator with inalienable rights to be free. And yet, the same people who were fighting England were enslaving people, and so you had this contradiction. And I want to talk a little bit about why it was and how it was that out of the American Revolution, ironically, there came a full-blown justification of racism that you did not have before the American Revolution. We'll get to that. First, there was a lot of people in the build-up to the revolution and during the revolution who recognized that the principles of the revolution clearly undermined American slavery. James Otis, the famous fiery lawyer, denounced slavery and affirmed the Negro's inalienable right to freedom in his Rights of the British Colonies in 1764. The Reverend Isaac Skillman, in his oration on the beauties of liberty in 1772, demanded the immediate abolition of slavery. Benjamin Franklin was a big anti-slavery activist, and Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry, also was opposed to slavery, even though both Benjamin Franklin and Rush, they weren't egalitarians or anti-racists. They were opposed to slavery. Abigail Adams, upon the discovery of a slave plot in Boston in 1774, wrote to her husband, "It always appeared to me a most iniquitous scheme to me to be fighting ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have." Thomas Paine's first article was entitled African Slavery in America in 1775, and he demanded that slavery be abolished and that the freedmen be given land so that they would not be dependent for their sustenance. So there was the religious sentiment against slavery. The Baptists, the Methodists, the Quakers particularly were opposed to slavery. By 1775, you have the formation of the First Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery in Philadelphia. Rhode Island in the 1770s, I don't have the exact date here, declared that any Negro brought into the territory was to be freed. The inhabitants of America are generally engaged in the preservation of their own rights and liberties, among which that of the personal freedom must be considered as the greatest, and those who are desirous of enjoying all the advantages of liberty themselves should be willing to extend personal liberty to others. Massachusetts in 1776 outlawed the slave trade, and Vermont in 1777 created a new constitution in which they said that if all men are created equal, then slavery is unconstitutional, and that anyone brought into Vermont anyone born in this country or brought to Vermont from out of this country would be free. There would be no slavery in Vermont. The Massachusetts Constitution ended slavery in 1780. New Jersey's Constitution ended slavery in 1804. It wasn't exactly that the American Revolution did away with slavery completely, but in the North, what you would expect happened, which is that the northern states abandoned slavery. In the southern states, there was initially a move towards manumission. There was easing of the ability to free slaves, and there were a number of slaves who were freed by masters and legislatures who were grateful for their service during the Revolution. You should be clear that African Americans were a part of the Revolution. They fought on both sides of the Revolution. And in general, tried every which way that they could to advance their own freedom. So, but during the Revolution, the South had to tighten its control of its slaves, because whenever the British armies came, the slaves would run away. So it was a very alarming situation. Every time a British ship came in, for example, they would often leave with a host of slaves. It's estimated that 1 in 6 of all the slaves, men, women, and children, escaped slavery during the American Revolution. They were not standing still for it. The southern colonies lost massive numbers of slaves. And despite that, after the American Revolution, they agreed to end the importation of slaves to the United States in 1808, and this was because I think that they all realized that they didn't want. It was a nightmare for them. Slavery was a necessary evil. It was something that you didn't want to perpetuate. You wanted America to be a white country, not a country of an interracial, mixed racial country. So that there was an agreement to end the slave trade, but slavery itself was entrenched and in the South, and the fact that the revolution did not result in the abolition of slavery throughout the country laid the seeds for the massive bloodletting that would take place only a half century later. So Black protest slavery. So the inhabitants of Black people, were active in going to state legislatures and pointing out how inconsistent it was, and that they deserved their freedom. They got lawyers. They sued. New Hampshire. They went and they argued that by what right do you keep us in chains when you yourselves are fighting against? And the rhetoric of the revolution was, this was George Washington's words: if we do not resist, we shall end up slaves like the Negroes over whom we rule with such arbitrary sway. So that it was clear that this contradiction. There was also the Lord Dunmore, the British governor of Virginia. When was this? In 1775, he issued a proclamation saying that any slaves that wanted to join him to fight against Virginia's uprising would be emancipated. And there was no CNN, there was no news, there was no newspapers. The slaves themselves lived in tightly controlled environments, and yet once Lord Dunmore issued this proclamation, it spread like wildfire through the grapevine. The African American slaves had a way of communicating without the white masters understanding a word that they were saying. They would sing as they worked, and in their songs they would communicate messages that would be sent far and wide. And in 2 weeks of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, 600 former slaves had arrived at his doorstep saying, "Hey, here we are, we're ready to fight." And in fact, Aptheker makes the point that the American Revolution would have ended very differently had the British been willing to fully support emancipation. The fact was that thousands, tens of thousands of African slaves ran away and came to British lines, often to die or be sold to slavery in the West Indies, which was even worse. I mean, and this also got out, so that the slave population knew that really. And still they tried to escape to British lines, knowing the dangers. That's how desperate people were. But had the British actually embraced emancipation, there's no doubt that they would have had tens of thousands of slaves flocking to them, willing to fight and die for their freedom. As it was, there were a number of slaves who decided to support the revolution and the ideals of the revolution. So Thomas Jefferson declared that Virginia alone, in a single year of 1778, lost 30,000 slaves through flight. Georgia declared that their state had lost 75 to 85% of their slaves in the midst of the American Revolution. It appears to be conservative to say that from 1775 to 1783, some 100,000 slaves emancipated themselves. One of the things that I said when I was talking about the Civil War was that it's absurd to say that the white people emancipated the slaves, and the point was that from the beginning of slavery, the most active people undermining slavery in the United States were the African Americans, who were themselves the brunt of all this brutality. It's not so hard to understand that it's the people who suffer the most who have the most at stake and who are going to work the hardest to try to change things. And every effort they made benefited the poor white community more than it ever benefited them. I mean, and it's not that wasn't their goal, but the point was that, for example, in the South, there was no educational system for poor white children. The elite white planters hired teachers and sent their students to private academies and to the North and to London. They had plenty of money to educate their children. In the meantime, the poor white children, there were no public schools, no education. In the North, there was public education, because in the North you had an industrial society that needed educated workers. But in the South, they purposely had anti-education legislation because they were afraid that if you taught white children, if you set up schools and you taught the poor white kids, I mean, what was the point of it anyway? They would teach the black kids, and just trouble. And teaching a slave to read was definitely a bad idea. So in the South, there's no educational system for white children. After the Civil War, when the Freedmen's Bureau set up an educational system for black children in the South, it included white children. And for the first time ever, you had an educational system that poor white children could be educated. So that every advance in civil rights was an advance for the downtrodden, the oppressed, the poor. So revolt says that there were Maroons. There always were Maroons. Maroons were communities of runaway slaves that lived in small communities. They hadn't escaped slavery. They were still in the South, but they were living in swamps and things like this. And they were vicious. They would attack a home, kill everybody, and steal everything, and because they had to live this desperate life. And in the middle of the American Revolution, that phenomenon was increased. You also had in Georgia, you had the swamp fox. What was his name? Francis Marion, yes, Francis Marion. Oh, the Green Mountain Boys. So blacks fought everywhere. They were part of the Green Mountain Boys who took Fort Ticonderoga. They were part of Francis Marion's, the Swamp Fox led a group of 20 to 30, never more than 30, kind of like military group, this independent group, and he harassed the hell out of the British, and he's in the South. He was a plantation owner. He had black and white poor people, working with him, fighting with him, going through the swamps, and so you had, especially in the Merchant Marine, our Navy was filled with blacks. George Washington's army, Bunker Hill, they were black. There was no fight in the American Revolution that did not involve African Americans. The Congress of the United States told George Washington that he couldn't use black troops, that he had to let them go. And he said that, sorry, I can't do that. And he said, I'm sure that you'll agree, and that he has thousands of these troops. He needed them. And they said, okay, you can keep these, but no more, and but it was an insane, whichever side would have, this was invaluable help. We have many stories of African Americans serving the revolution. So the spies. For example, an unnamed Negro, this is, I'm reading now from Aptheker's chapter, the record of Negro services in the Army and the Navy as fighters and workers does not complete the account of their direct aid to the military effort of the revolution. For excellent evidence exists proving that Negroes also performed valiantly as spies. For example, an unnamed Negro contributed significantly to the overwhelming defeat inflicted upon the British force at Eddington, North Carolina on December 8, 1775. The Negro, acting under direct orders of the American commander, Colonel Forsyth, entered the British camp and told in such convincing fashion of a weak, disorganized American force that the English hastily attacked what was in reality a well-prepared and strategically placed American force. The result was 100 British casualties contrasted to 1 American killed. Of this engagement, the late distinguished historian William E. Dodd wrote, "It was a godsend to the revolutionaries of Virginia. It stirred a drooping spirits, and as they had never been stirred since Lexington." So the blacks fought in the American Revolution on both sides, but they were essential to the American victory in the American Revolution. And the question then becomes, how is it that out of this, you would have, emerging from the American Revolution, a full-blown ideological justification of slavery? So that's where we go now. I want to start, first of all, by saying that this is Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence that he drafted, had one of the clauses against the king, or the bad things that he had done to us, was eliminated. It was edited out of the document. And here's what it says. The king has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the person of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them off into slavery in another hemisphere to incur miserable death in their transportation to their or to become enslaved. I said, then he went on to say, exciting those poor people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty which he has deprived them of by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them. Obtruded meaning it was all his fault. He forced us into having slaves, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urged them to commit against the lives of another. The delegates from Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, objected to it. They just took that out. One has to wonder about Thomas Jefferson's thoughts on this. So the idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that wherever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them seems most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This is the difference between natural law and positive law. Natural law is the idea that there is a law that comes from God. It's a law of nature. The idea that human beings all are free. They're free. Afghanistan, they're free in Spain and England. All human beings are born to this state. There's another way of looking at it, which is that there's no such thing. I mean, you are, if you have a government that protects your right, and you have a Bill of Rights, and you have a Constitution, then you can live relatively free. But that's because your freedom and your rights are dependent on your citizenship, your membership in a collective. It's not something that everybody enjoys. The American Revolution was founded on this principle of natural rights, so the problem was, how do you justify slavery? If all men are created equal, you have to conclude that Africans are not men. Therefore, Africans are not created equal. The result is an increase in racism because you're justifying something in a way that you never justified it before. Before the American Revolution, there was slavery. People objected to slavery, but the slaveholders themselves never felt it necessary to develop any kind of full-blown ideological justification for slavery. In fact, originally Thomas Jefferson had said slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. Very uncomfortable situation, but you dare not let go because the wolf will attack you. It is a necessary evil. It isn't something that we ever wanted or that is good for us. And if there was some way, and in the South, you had a colonization society that was created, in the first years after the American Revolution, which the idea was let's compensate slave holders for their property. Let's put them on boats and send them back to Africa and get rid of these people. So you had, on the one hand, this sense that you have a serious contradiction, and the way that you are going to explain this is by dehumanizing the people who you are oppressing. It's where you justify the brutality. So out of the American Revolution, there developed a full-blown justification of slavery. White Southerners needed to defend their holding of other human beings in bondage against the notion that all men are created equal. Consequently, they began to argue that blacks were less than fully human and that the principles of Republican equality applied only to whites. It was very similar to all men. When Jefferson said all men are created, he didn't mean women and he didn't mean children. Women had no political rights. And so when he said men, he meant men, and he also meant really white men. So I think I'll leave it there for this week, and we'll see you next week with another edition of More Bad News. I've actually one more thing I wanted to say about the title of this week is The Negro in the American Revolution. The Negro. The Negro has been identified in America in many different ways. There's Negro, colored, African American, Black. So the how he is referred. I referred it to as this because the Aptheker's chapter is called "The Negro in the American Revolution." Um, but in general, what we want to do is you want to ask somebody, it's like, do you mind being? The Jews had this same thing. They objected to be calling Jews. American Jews wanted to be called American Hebrews because hey, you heard the story about the guy who got Jewed. To be Jewed meaning to be cheated. You had gypsies and Jews, and those were derogatory terms. And the gypsies objected to be calling gypsies. They wanted to be called Romani, and the Jews objected to be calling Jews. And African Americans have objected over time to various designations. How are you going to call them? And the answer to this is very simple. You respect someone's opinion. Call me Ahab. Call me who I tell you what I tell you to call me. And the Talmud says it's a terrible thing to give people nicknames anyway, especially derogatory ones. But whenever we start with this, the Negro or the Jews, you're always in trouble because these are reifications. You can discuss them historically, but I am a Jew. The Jews and a Jew is a major difference. And what are these designations? They're very complex, large, I said reifications. They don't really exist in reality. We create these categories. When you look at the human species, there's only one. The differences are absolutely minor. And in ancient times, they didn't even notice the difference between color and hair and size of ears and things. They just, in the Bible, you see there's no descriptions of anybody as being white or black or tall or short. I mean, we don't. For Moses, for example, we have no idea what he looked like. So there's these ideas. The first idea that people had was, we're okay and you're not. It's tribal, but not racial. That racism emerges with modern science. It emerges after the Enlightenment. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. It's been a long 2 programs, and I'll talk to you next week. Have a good week, and don't forget to smoke camels. Take the camels challenge. You won't regret it.